This is Garis book readings of my two published paper books, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is chapter 6, entitled Institutions of Globa, from my second book, entitled Multis and Monos: What the Multicultured Can Teach the Monocultured Towards the Creation of a Global State. Chapter 6. Institutions of Globa. Subtopic headings: A. Introduction. B. Global Constitution. C. Global President. D. Global Parliament. E. Global Political Parties. F. Global Laws. G. Global Civil Service. H. Global Police. I. Global Court. J. Global Military. K. Globiversities and Global Education. L. Global Taxation. M. Global Wealth Distribution. N. Global Resources. O. Global Unions. P. Global Incomes Policy. Q. Global Currency Unit. R. Global Health Insurance. A. Introduction. Chapter 5 dealt with those economic, technological, social and political forces that are leading the world towards the creation of Globa, the global state, making it virtually inevitable. This chapter describes the many institutions that Globa, that's the name of the world state, will actually need to function. As readers will readily see, many of the institutions proposed below are fairly simple extensions of institutions that already exist at lower levels, that is, at union or national levels. For example, proposing a global parliament is a simple extension of the familiar national or European parliament. We propose over a dozen global institutions and make no pretense. Just a minute, let me center this better. And make no pretense that the list is exhaustive. The institutions proposed here are more a sample, but do at least cover the most important ones. For example, Globa will need a global constitution, a global president, a global parliament consisting of global political parties to make global laws. Globa will need a global civil service to execute those laws, a global police force to enforce those laws, a global court to adjudicate those laws, and a global military of peacekeepers. One such institutions include the creation of globiversities, that is, global universities, for the creation of a global education system. The global parliament will need to implement a global taxation scheme so as to aid global wealth distribution by distributing global resources and defending workers' rights by creating global unions. It will also push for a global incomes policy, a global currency, a global health service, etc. B. Global Constitution. A new global government will need a new constitution, which is based upon the fundamental principles of a world democratic state. Ad-libbing, in other words, not a dictatorship by the hated Jewish banksters as part of their fulfillment of the Talmudic prophecy to create a world government, which is effectively a fascist dictatorship ruled by the Jewish banksters with their capital in Jerusalem, and they then proceed to wipe out the Goy, that's a Jewish word for non-Jew, in other words 99.8% of the world population, with the word Goy having strong connotations to Jews of meaning cattle. So I have an utter hatred of the Jewish banksters and what they want, and which is a rival to this global vision, or Globa vision of a world democratic state. Back to the book. The actual details of such a constitution will not be given here. They will need to be worked out incrementally as more and more countries or blocs join the emerging semi-global state. The actual detailed points of the constitution will probably depend on the history of its creation. For example, imagine that the world state is formed by the accretion model, starting with the EU, European Union, with later the North American countries joining, etc. If the US joins the EU, then given America's power, it's highly likely that the EU will have to modify its constitution somewhat. When Russia joins, there will be further compromises, etc. It would therefore be rather a waste of time for me to try to predict the detailed points of such a world constitution. Nevertheless, the broad outlines ought to be stated. The basic assumption of the Constitution that it is to be democratic, with all the usual democratic institutions that time-tested experience shows to work fairly well. That is, an elected world parliament, an elected world president. Whether elected by the parliament or directly by the people would depend on whether the global state chose to operate under a US-style presidential system or a European-style parliamentary system. A global civil service, an independent global judiciary, a free global media, the usual rights to free assembly, free speech, freedom of religion, to unionize, that is, form trade unions, etc. All these standard ideas would be carried over and scaled up from the union level or nation-state level to the world level. C. Global president. The buck has to stop somewhere. All institutions need leaders who make the top decisions. Even a global state will need a president or prime minister. I suggest using the term president rather than prime minister, simply because the former is shorter than the latter, that is 3 syllables against 4. A global president, that is, president of Globa, would be elected either by a global parliament or directly by the people of the earth in huge elections. There are arguments either way. The Europeans claim that their parliamentary system is more efficient and more likely to elect someone politically competent with experience than is the American presidential system, in which the people vote for the president directly. When parliament members vote for a leader, they know who is good and who is not. They are thus more likely to vote for someone they respect and who has superior political ability. The American system all too often votes in a president who is a popular fool with a dubious background. On the other hand, the US presidential system is more democratic. Since the US is far more nationalistic than the European EU countries, which have been diluting their national sovereignties for decades, it's likely that the EU will form the seed from which the global state may grow. The US will probably be much slower at accepting the idea of giving up its sovereignty, having been the dominant power for over half a century. Therefore, I would not be surprised if the global president is elected by the members of the global parliament rather than by the people of the planet. When the US finally joins the emerging and growing semi-global state, it will probably have to accommodate to an already existing and much larger political bloc than the US. Even at the time of writing, the EU is much larger in population terms than the US, that is 500 million to 300 million in the US. It has a similarly sized GUP, that is, gross union product. The EU is the largest trading bloc in the world, so the EU-based semi-global state will force the US to compromise more than the US can force the EU to compromise. But there will be compromises on both sides. D. Global Parliament. There must obviously be a democratically elected global parliament, presumably with proportional representation, that is, where the number of parliament members is directly proportional to the number of constituents they represent. For example, 1 member per 6 million people. When the time comes to write the constitution on how the global parliament is to be constituted, account will have to be taken of the fact that some countries have populations smaller than 6 million, so how to represent them. With a leg and an arm? The EU has been haggling for years over how its European Parliament should be constituted, what powers it should have, what voting system should be used. For example, unanimity or majority, etc. One can imagine similar haggling as the global parliament is constituted bit by bit. Hopefully the global parliament can learn from the experiences of the Euro Parliament and avoid some of the hassles that the EU went through in its youth. The question arises as to where such a parliament should be housed. Could parliamentary meetings be done entirely electronically with 3D images in virtual realities? This is perhaps possible if the technology is good enough at the time. If so, then the question of the location of the world's capital could be made irrelevant, but if not, then where should the world's capital be? Probably it'll be located at the capital of the initial seed institute or semi-global state. For example, at the capital of the EU, if it is the EU that starts the accretion model, so the capital would be Brussels. If the UN is updated to form a global state, and since the UN is based in New York, then New York would probably become the world capital. If the US continues its support of Zionism in Palestine, then the Arabs could blow up the World Parliament building in New York. The Global Parliament could be given the title Globan Parliament, GP. Elected members of the GP could be called members of the Globan Parliament, that is MGP, similar to the way members of the European Parliament are called MEPs. E. Global political parties. To keep the global democracy healthy and on its toes, global political parties should be formed. The question then arises, how many parties? Only two, as effectively in the British and American models, or several, as in the Italian and Euro Parliament models? I suspect, given the greater diversity of a world parliament than a national parliament, that the number of global political parties will be more than two. The major parties are likely to be much the same as in national and union parliaments, with perhaps some new ones, for example, socialist in the West European sense of the word, conservative, liberal, green, communist, globist, etc. The European Parliament has a lot of experience on how to run a multinational parliament. At the time of writing, there are 27 nations in the European Union, EU. This experience should prove to be invaluable as a global parliament is formed bit by bit, as country after country or bloc joins it. F. Global laws. The role of the global parliament, of course, will be to create global laws, that is, laws applying to the whole planet, or at least to those countries which have decided to join the semi-global state. As new countries and blocs join, semi-Globa, they will be subject to these laws. Hence the decision of a national government to join Globa will imply a reduction in the level of sovereignty of that nation-state, no light undertaking. For example, as will be mentioned in greater detail below on the points concerning greater wealth distribution and global resources, the decision to join Globa would imply the loss of the traditional right to own raw materials found on one's territory. For example, the oil under the ground in an Arab country would traditionally belong to the Arabs living in that country, or at least to their political leaders, if they are corrupt and exploitative. However, with global law, that would no longer be the case. By today's standards and values, the people living in a faraway country are them, not us, so are less valued. That is, one is much less willing to share one's wealth and raw material wealth with such strangers. But with a global culture, with a global media and a global language, the traditional attitude towards strangers will slowly die away and be replaced by a feeling of living in a global village, to use McLuhan's term. With billions of people feeling like that, the traditional them and us mentality will become far weaker, making the acceptance of global laws more palatable. To make a historical analogy, consider the adjustment needed when the city-states of Italy finally merged into the nation-state of Italy under the influence of Garibaldi in the 19th century. The laws of the city-states had to be scaled up and modified to become appropriate for a large nation-state consisting of many millions of people, rather than for a city-state with under 1 million people. Differences in values and customs between the city-states had to be taken into account. A similar situation occurred when the German-speaking regions formed into a nation-state under the influence of Bismarck. Also in the 19th century, Italy and Germany were rather late forming modern nation-states compared to older nations such as France and the UK. Raw material wealth needed to be shared. Just because some coal deposits were found near a particular city did not mean that that coal belonged to that city. It belonged to the whole country. The tax revenues coming from the profits of the companies exploiting the coal were distributed to the whole country, not just to the citizens of the nearby city. A similar logic will apply to Globa. Again, the EU has a lot of experience with creating laws that apply to all 27 countries of the EU and can help the global, or the Globan Parliament. When a new country wishes to join the EU, a lengthy preparation phase of negotiation between the EU and the new entry candidate country is undertaken. The candidate country is usually required to modify many of its laws to bring them into line with those of the EU. One can readily imagine a similar process occurring in the future when a country wants to join Globa. If the EU keeps growing and changes its ideology into one of pioneering the formation of Globa, then at some stage the EU will need to change its name because it will no longer be European. The procedure of the absorption of new candidate countries into the EU